few years after the Second World War ended, Winston Churchill told his private secretary,
"No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress, as I did those of President Roosevelt."
Churchill was reflecting on the most famous transatlantic relationship in history. Their image, and Churchill's own depiction, is of a golden age of collaboration. A far-sighted American president is seduced by the bravery and eloquence of a beleaguered prime minister and rides to his rescue. But this rosy picture is largely myth. In reality, the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, the two great leaders of 20th century democracy, began with a bruising psychological duel. It ran in tandem with the parallel duel between the two 20th century tyrants of totalitarianism, Hitler and Stalin, which led to the Nazi invasion of Russia. Like the duel of the dictators, it was riddled with mutual suspicion, false promises and evasion. Even when the two men grew closer, it became apparent that they were fighting for entirely different long-term objectives. In that lay the seeds of bitter disillusion and disagreement about how to bring freedom to hundreds of millions of people. On May the 10th, 1940, on a bright spring morning in Washington, President Roosevelt called a meeting of his cabinet to discuss astonishing news coming in from Europe. Nazi forces were smashing into France, Holland and Belgium. In Britain, there was political turmoil. Harold Ickes, the American Secretary of the Interior, was a senior member of Roosevelt's government.
While we were at cabinet, word was brought in that Chamberlain had resigned. The president said that he supposed that Churchill was the best man that England had, even if he was drunk half of his time.
That evening, Churchill became British Prime Minister. A few days later, he told his son, Randolph, there was only one way to beat Hitler.
"I shall drag in the United States."
Little did Churchill know that his entire strategy for winning the war depended on seducing a man who not only thought him a drunk, but also held a dislike for him that stretched back more than 20 years. The roots of that dislike lay in Roosevelt's memory of the one and only face-to-face meeting he'd ever had with Churchill. In 1918, as American Undersecretary for the Navy, and before he was disabled, he'd visited France and Britain. He later remarked that Churchill, then Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, had been
a stinker, lording it all over us.
The two men had not seen each other since, and in the decade leading up to the Second World War, they appeared to be polar opposites. Roosevelt, the charismatic president. Churchill, the has-been stuck in the political wilderness. Roosevelt, the scourge of European colonialism. Churchill, the die-hard defender of the British Empire. But one thing united them. They both understood from early on that Hitler presented a new and terrible force with which peaceful coexistence would be impossible. So when Churchill returned to the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty on the outbreak of war, Roosevelt immediately started a transatlantic cable correspondence with him.
My dear Churchill, it is because you and I occupied similar positions in the World War that I want you to know how glad I am that you are back again in the Admiralty.
Privately, Roosevelt told the American ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy,
I have always disliked him since the time I went to England in 1918.
I'm giving him attention now because there is a strong possibility that he will become Prime Minister, and I want to get my hand in now.
The first test of the relationship between these men, who had so little in common, took place in the intense crucible of Hitler's blitzkrieg. Churchill's opening tactic was to try to shock Roosevelt into helping Britain and France.
May. The scene has darkened swiftly. I trust you realize, Mr. President, that the voice and force of the United States may count for nothing if they are withheld too long. You may have a completely subjugated, Nazified Europe established with astonishing swiftness.
Churchill told Roosevelt that Britain's very survival could depend on the immediate loan of 50 American destroyers, mothballed since the First World War. The next day, Roosevelt refused him. Churchill's first request had resulted in instant disappointment. But for the president, the loan was too big a political risk. The United States was still a land at peace, trying to enjoy life, and bound by neutrality laws. Then, 3 weeks later, the Italian dictator Mussolini entered the war. Roosevelt had asked Mussolini to keep out. That night, he showed his anger.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
Roosevelt promised Britain and France immediate practical help.
We will extend to the opponents of force the material resources of this nation.
Churchill was thrilled, as his private secretary, John Colville, noted in his diary. It seemed that this time the president was going to deliver.
June the 12th, 1940. Winston seems to hope that America will come in now, at any rate as a non-belligerent ally.
As Paris prepared for the Nazi onslaught, and its children were evacuated, Roosevelt even followed up with a private message to Churchill and the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, reinforcing his promise to help.
This government is doing everything in its power to make available to the Allied governments the material they so urgently require.
Churchill pounced on Roosevelt's promise.
15th of June. We must ask as a matter of life and death to be reinforced with these destroyers. We will carry out the struggle whatever the odds, but it may well be beyond our resources, unless we receive every reinforcement.
But on June the 17th, France surrendered to the Nazis. Roosevelt believed that Britain too could go under. There was no point in trying to rescue a drowning man. Just days after the promise of help, he slammed the door shut.
The 19th of June. President R has turned down our demand for 40 destroyers. We need them badly.
This opening skirmish in their duel was a shattering blow to Churchill. In reality, he was deluding himself in thinking, even fleetingly, that Roosevelt could at that stage have made any declaration committing Americans to the prospect of war.